All right. Hello, everyone, and thanks a lot for the introduction. I hope people have still energy left for the last talk before the coffee break. And I'm going to be doing the talk on creating design systems in React Native, and more specifically about our experience we had at Shopify. So I will start with this tweet from our Director of Engineering, Farhan, where he announced that React Native is the future of mobile at Shopify. And this tweet is now over 3 years old, and a lot of things have changed since then. And we can proudly say that all of our apps actually use React Native, and all but one are fully React Native. So what is this odd egg? So this odd egg is Shopify Mobile, which is the core app for the Shopify product that merchants use daily, and is the companion app to the Shopify web admin. And this app has been around the longest time from the apps, and this is also why it's been the most complex to turn it into a full React Native app. So we fully started migrating the app in 2022, but we started researching this much sooner. And as far as the scale of the app goes, there's more than 600 screens per platform, and doing a full rewrite would take us a really long time, and in that time we would not really be able to ship anything. So instead of doing a rewrite, we decided for a hybrid approach where we migrate screens gradually. So we're kind of in a mix of a native and a React Native app. And as we migrate, we try to make every screen, of course, a little bit better. If you want to learn more about the migration process specifically, my colleague Mauricio wrote a blog post about it, so you can check it on our engineering blog. And one of the important things for supporting the migration and that it goes fast was a good design system that allows developers to be really productive and fast. The design system at Shopify is called Polaris, and you actually might know Polaris even though the mobile one is internal, and that is because there is also Polaris on web, and this framework is actually open source since it can be used by the third-party developers for creating Shopify apps. And Polaris on web is built with React, and since we now have our design system in React Native, we could reuse a lot of stuff from the library. We actually reuse icons and tokens like colors directly. We import them in our mobile design system from their package. And we also use it as a huge source of inspiration. So we try to keep the API as similar as possible. We do diverge in some cases where mobile differs too much from web, but if there's not a good reason, we try to stick what Polaris team has already come up with. And we also try to keep the set of components relatively similar. And we use it for inspiration of other things like doc structures and their principles and more. We also try to treat our design system as an internal product. That helps with a lot of things. If we treat it as a product, it helps with the maintenance of the design system, since the external developers can then, the feature developers can then not necessarily go to the design system team and always ask, like, how do I use this? Because as an internal product, we have a really high quality documentation of components, so they can use that as a source of truth instead of overloading the design system team. Another thing that we did is to have really minimal coupling with the rest of the app, and eventually we actually extracted it into a monorepo package, so the Shopify mobile app itself only imports from the design system package, but not vice versa. That also helps us with keeping it simple to contribute to the design system, because the complexity is lower as it is in a more contained environment. And as an internal product, we also have things like changelogs, so developers know which things have changed since the last internal release, screenshots as contribution guidelines, so it's easy for feature teams to actually contribute back to the library and more. Another thing that we needed to think hard about is how to scale the design system. We wanted to scale it across a lot of surfaces and keep it going for years to go. And one key thing that we found is that for the design system it's really important to have a limited number of components. First, if you have a lot of components, it's difficult for developers then to find what component they actually do need to use. And second of all, it makes the maintenance of such a design system with a lot of components really hard. And you kind of need to bring more and more people into the team, which is counterproductive. So to keep a limited number of components, you need the components to be really highly reusable and flexible to kind of allow for all the different use cases the feature teams will then need. And another thing that you want for the design system to enforce is consistency, because the design system is going to be used across a lot of different surfaces, and you don't want each feature team to kind of have their own design language and kind of diverge in things that are not necessary. And the primary way how we enforce consistency is having a good theme file that includes things like colors and icons. There's a little bit of a trade-off between the consistency and flexibility. As you increase the flexibility, you probably lower the amount of consistency that you can enforce. But I will go into that a little bit deeper later in the talk. For theming, we use a restyle library that was already on stage presented by Lorenzo. And restyle is great for the design system because it allows you to have TypeScript enforced theming. So with TypeScript, you can enforce the developers don't actually use tokens that are not in the app, or that they don't use custom colors that somebody came up with. They can only use the colors that are inside the theme. And another good thing about using TypeScript for the theming is that you get actually auto-completion for the individual tokens. So it is a source of truth, not only for colors, but also for icons, for spacing, sizing. And we actually found out that it's beneficial to try to put as much into the theme as possible. So we also started adding things like border width and border radius, because we saw the developers still kind of diverge, and sometimes they use stylesheet.headline width, somebody uses one, so it's better to just use the theme and kind of codify it in a single place. And the library is open source, so you are free to use it. So let's go a little bit deeper into the consistency and flexibility trade-off that I kind of touched on earlier. How we think about it is there's kind of two different types of components. There are either flat components or deep components. And for flat components, like an icon that renders just an SVG, that's a place where you can really kind of enforce a lot of consistency. So for the icon, we have a source, which is just from the limited set of icons that are coming from the Polaris web package. We have only a limited set of colors, not any color from the theme, but just those that we define that we want to be used for icons. And we have just a limited set of sizes for the icons. We don't want the icons to be any size, but just a limited set. So yeah, this is great for these kind of more simple, really flat components. Then you have a bit more complex components, like if you have a header, and the header has three children all together. It has a title, it has a subtitle, and an action. For the title and the subtitle, for the most part, you're going to have just simple strings, and maybe developers don't need a flexibility here, so you don't need to cater for that. But for the action, it is possible, and what we saw in our header in Polaris was that in 80% of the use cases, people can still use the predefined header action that's going to be kind of your regular button with some title and on action, but there's like 20% of use cases where they kind of need something really, really custom. They either need like a badge in there or what have you. And the problem, if we only started putting things into the header action, was that this list could just grow to support these 20% of the use cases. We don't take this decision lightly. It's always like important to think about, do I really need this level of flexibility? But you need to allow it unless, otherwise you'll kind of get into a process where developers keep coming to you with like new requests and kind of you need to rethink all of that. And then there's like even more complex components like that are really deep and have like lots of children. So we have this what we call a list item, and this list item has some title, some badge, it has an image, but it might not have an image, that it has some metadata that have various emphasis. Maybe they can have a different order. And if you just started with a list of props, you can end up with something like this, where there's an optional title, there's an optional checkbox, maybe the checkbox needs to be on the right, maybe it needs to be on the left, and then you have a list of variants, then you need to flip them, and like developers keep coming with new and new requests, and then the component gets more and more complex, and the list of props just expands indefinitely. So yeah, probably not great. It's probably a sign that you should rethink your component if this list of props just grows this large. So what we do in this case is we try to identify the individual subparts of that component. So in the case of the list item, we identify, we have like a title and then the individual metadata blocks, and then there is a badge. And what we do after is create, instead of sort of a builder pattern, where we create basically individual subcomponents of that list item. So you know that each individual subcomponent is really easy to use, really easy to understand. A list item title just have a simple title prop, which is just a string. And then there's this list item summary, which was that with the bullet points, and it's also very easy to define. And then it's on the developer to kind of compose these things together. Sure, this can introduce some inconsistency because then it's kind of on the feature teams to own that the layout still makes sense. But it's still better than kind of trying to put everything in the design system and then it would like just explode. So I think it's better. I want to go a little bit deeper in the tech stack. I already mentioned that we use Restyle. Another tool that we use is Justify, which is our internal tool for screenshot testing. How we think about screenshot testing is generally that we do really granular screenshot tests for the components in the design system. We have really lots of them for a lot of different scenarios. And then what we do in the app is more screenshot tests on a per screen basis, so that the amount of tests kind of stays relatively low, because each screenshot test does bring some maintenance burden in the end. And then the screenshot tests are really valuable for UX feedback, unless the UXers need to interact with the component. They can basically just look at the screenshot test and confirm that they look as they would expect. Another thing that we use and that we unveiled last year is flash lists. Of course, anything that has a list at Shopify needs to be a flash list at this point. And a design system, each component needs to be really fast. And we think that this solution provides that pretty well. As far as additional tooling goes that we use really heavily in our design system is we use Figma for the designs themselves to collaborate with the UX team. We use Reanimated, like the majority of the community, and then we use Docusaurus for the internal documentation. It is really easy to set up, and then that's the place that our developers go to and kind of try to understand how they should use the individual components. And last but not least, we use very heavily the storybook, which is open source and not by us, that we use to kind of work on components in a more in their own kind of environment instead of having to put those components in the app and kind of play with them there. I'll show the storybook and the docu-source and some of the other edition tooling in the live demo. Because I don't like myself and I like doing live demos. So let me first show you around like the demo app. So what we have is a very simple setup. We have the storybook here that has a sidebar, and in the sidebar you can find all the components that have their stories. The stories are loaded based on the name of the file and then based on the syntax provided by the storybook library. As far as the components go, we have a box that comes from the restyle library. So the box under the hood, the create box method under the hood, basically takes regular React Native view and then adds theme semantics on top of that. So we can access the theme values. Most of the box mapping are simple mappings between the value of the string value and, for example, a number in case of like spacing. But you can also define more complex functions if you need to. And then we have a text that also uses a method from Resell called create text, and basically does the same, but for the text from React Native. Right. So let's try to build a new component. What we're going to build is a very simple batch component that has some pill background and some text inside of it, nothing too complex. And what we usually do for creating components is we have a kind of a scaffold script, and the scaffold script contains templates for creating new components from scratch. This is really valuable. First, it makes it really easy to create new components, since developers don't really need to go to a different kind of already existing component, try to copy-paste the contents in their new file and kind of strip the things that they don't need. And second of all, it makes it easy to kind of keep the templates really always up to date with your current conventions. Because if the developer comes and copies like a really old component, they might kind of reuse conventions that you no longer use. Right, so let me trigger the script, and we're just gonna provide the name, and that's gonna then generate all the files that we need. So let's take a look what got generated. So we have a batch directory, and it has a, thank you, yes, this was a lot of work. It has an index file that exports a batch component, and we found also that it's really useful to export the props interface so that it's easy for developers to extend that component when they need to. Then we have the component itself that has some dummy documentation, and a dummy prop. Then we have the stories file that you already saw with the box. Screenshots that uses the React Native Testify library that the way you use it is you define a test suite through the create screenshot test, and then you add individual test cases in there. And you can see that we actually import a default batch from the last file that I haven't talked about yet, and that is this examples files that's used kind of as a source of truth for the stories, for the screenshots, and then also the documentation side actually uses this file to show all the examples in the docs, which is really useful for developers that are first interacting with the given component. At least personally, I find examples really useful. A lot of developers can then even basically just copy paste some examples and then go from there, and that kind of makes everything a bit faster, which is the whole point of our design system in the end. So we're going to build that really simple batch component. And this batch component, in terms of the props, it's going to just accept a simple string as a child, as you would have for a button or a text. And then we're going to render the background. In order for you not to have to watch me how I struggle typing, I just copy paste this. And we're going to import the box and then the text. The box is that kind of point of access for the theme. So for the padding horizontal, we don't use absolute values. We always use the values from the theme. And as I mentioned, since this is working on top of TypeScript, we get also all the niceties of TypeScript, as in I can just see the auto-completion and what kind of values I can actually use. But I'll keep it to the original size. And then I'm gonna take the children from the batch props and render them in there. The other thing that I need to update is now the examples file. Since I updated the component and its interface, I also need to update the example. So instead of using that example prop, I'm just gonna put it there as a child. And then for the storybook to update, I'll just do a quick reload. And I'll see my Polaris folder of stories, and I have the badge right here. So that was easy. All right, the good thing now is I can now use the testify. Now that I'm kind of satisfied with the component, I can use the testify library to generate new screenshots. So what you would typically do is run yarn testify test with a given platform, or if you don't specify a platform, it generates screenshots for both, but I'll just concentrate on iOS here. So let me generate it. The way it works is it spins up the app again and then changes the the registered React app component and kind of replaces it with the individual screenshot test that it dynamically finds based on the file names and based on the individual screenshot test cases. So I'll get a failure here because I have a missing reference image, so it just records an original image, but if I run it again, I'll get a successful run. Right, and now I'll actually can also go into the docs, and I'll see that it will reuse all the documentation of that batch. And here you will see all the examples that are in that examples file. So as you add more, the developers will be able to use this as kind of a quick reference if they need in a particular style of the batch. And you'll have the screenshots for the examples and the code. And you would have also the Android screenshot there if I created one. Right, now what if a designer comes in and kind of says, okay, that's all great, but maybe let's just swap the colors because I don't like them the way they are, all right? So we're just gonna update the color scheme. I'm going to go into a storybook, which is, again, great for that iterative development on a given component. And I'm going to use Restyle to give me those colors. And I'm just going to swap them around. And what I can do next is basically make sure that the screenshot test then capture what I kind of expect them to capture. So I'll get a failure because now the reference is, the new test case is kind of different from the baseline. So what I can do is open those test cases in a preview app, or you can use a different image viewer, and you'll see the origin or the reference image. You'll see the new image, and then you'll see with the div, which is a bit noisy in this case because we kind of changed the colors completely, but it's really great if there's like a really just a small difference, maybe like you move something like 2 pixels and it's really hard to change, so then this div viewer comes in really handy. So once you're satisfied with this, you can run yarn testify approve. Whoops, this way, and it's gonna commit those changes into a directory in the testify /reference folder, and then I can go into the docs and I'll get the images in the examples automatically regenerated. Again, if I change also the example here, that would be also automatically updated. Right. So what's next for mobile Polaris? Since we extracted it into a package, we could actually use it also in other apps, not just the Shopify Mobile app. So it is used now in Shopify Balance, and we also plan to use it in more Shopify apps in the future, because we kind of want them to speak the same design language. And as far as the web goes, we plan to make the UI feel even closer and kind of make these two frameworks live even closer to each other. And yeah, that's it. Thank you for your attention.